Oh, hello, and welcome to the first episode of our 5-part series of the AdTech Forum. We are so excited to have Bryan Simkins with us today. This is the first part of a 5-part series that's brought to you by our great partners, Flashtalking by Mediaocean.
Bryan is amazing. He gets excited about living in a time where the world is just even more connected than it ever has been. He is currently the Global EVP, Creative Media Solution at Publicis, and I'm excited to have him here. Bryan, welcome to the AdTech Forum.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk through some of this stuff.
One of the reasons why we thought you'd be one of our best guests and one of our first guests is because you know this ecosystem, you know AdTech, you know MarTech. What hasn't changed in this ecosystem when it comes to creative? Where have we not moved and innovated yet?
I mean, I guess I would say marketing's core purpose has not changed, right? So I think about marketing in its simplest form is the process of influence and impact. And so just from a fundamental standpoint, like that hasn't changed since in 100 years, right? Is the ability to reach people, influence them, they create some sort of desired response, right? Which is ultimately a transaction or a sale. So I think foundationally that hasn't changed. Now, the tools, the channels, the platforms, the technology, the data, all that's ever evolving and continues to evolve. And I think that's what we spend most of our time as marketers responding to is the changes in the evolution of the technologies and the data infrastructures that we're dealing with.
When you think about all the different brands, all the different marketers within our ecosystem, who comes to mind as some of the top savviest marketers? Who's doing it right when it comes to all things creative?
I think right's a relative term.
How so?
Well, I think businesses function differently, right? So depending on the nature of your business, I think what your goals are and how you produce creative and how you influence your customers may be uniquely different. How much access you have to customer data, where you have to reach people, the environments in which you reach people, all that's unique to the company, right? And the nature of their business, like as fundamentally as B2C and B2B, like those are entirely different marketing ecosystems and strategies. So I do
Sure.
think that's somewhat relative. In the context of this, when we're talking about data-driven creative and that sort of stuff, I think you certainly see people who are companies that are data heavy being advanced. And those are, anybody who has a direct access to the customer or is building a relationship directly with the customer, like that's certainly changed their business. Companies like e-com and hospitality and some of those are on the front end of that and have been. On the further backside, and not to speak negatively of, but certainly the companies that are further away from the customers, which would be like manufacturers and those types of companies, are probably more nascent in the development. But again, the world of D2C and all these things companies are navigating, they're building that. I would use Disney as a wonderful example of that, right? So they were historically somewhat had a carrier or a cable company between them and their content, or a studio, movie theater. But when you see like a Disney Plus arise, now Disney or Peacock, we all had to sign up to Peacock to watch the Chiefs game last weekend. So many of these companies who have historically been one step away from their customers are getting closer to their customers and getting more customer data. And that's driving them to enhance the way in which they relate to and try to influence their customers.
Really appreciate how you called out the different categories of e-commerce and hospitality. I agree. Disney does a fantastic job when it comes to the personalization of creative, and they have so many different hallmarks to their brand. Now, Bryan, you've been in this game for a while, and across all of the different brands that you touch across Publicis globally, technically speaking, how do you measure good creative? What do you do?
Everything's like there's multiple dimensions to everything, right? Sure. Like how I think about it. So again, I think of I'm not a creative expert. I'm not a chief ECD. Like that's not my career. Like they would probably maybe be more qualified to answer that question. I'm more of a technologist and an infrastructure person, right? So again, I would say good creative is quote unquote creative that works, which is a nebulous definition. So I think you have to go deeper into what are you trying to accomplish from a KPIs and goals expect. We can take historical marketing funnel as far as awareness, consideration, conversion, transaction. Like those are things that are often put up against whether or not a creative is effective or not within a campaign. So I think that's a starting point, is just developing those campaign objectives and goals. And then you do your best to determine if the creative is influencing the way in which you aspire for it to influence. Again, an awareness campaign of a brand or a new product is going to have very different works, right, or good, than something that's a lower funnel DR and is trying to elicit an immediate action or transaction. So I think that's how we dimensionalize whether or not creative works per se, or is good.
You touch on a lot. And I love this because this is, 10-minute, like really fast kind of video series that we're doing. And you mentioned one thing that's really important, which is, the foundation of marketing hasn't necessarily changed. The tools have changed, the capabilities have changed, the technology has changed. But as a core, we're still, trying to achieve the same thing. But as we're starting to see data points change, and as we're starting to see deprecation of cookies, like how do you see data and personalization playing a role and changing how marketers work over the next, 12 months as we start to see kind of the landscape change quite a bit?
Yeah, so I think there's two large aspects to that. One, the tools that we're using are changing, right? So when you think about the ad technology itself, we use the term precision content, right? Which has an orientation that we dimensionalize through what we call CMPs, which are composite, mass producing many versions. I think creative in general is going through an evolution that web development went through 15 years ago, which is deconstructing the creative objects from the presentation of that presentation layer, which is, those of you who are web developers know, when we went from table to CSS and that sort of stuff. And that revolutionized web development when you start pulling that apart and styling the content differently than the objects themselves. But I mean, we think of precision content in CMPs, DCO, right? Which is Flashtalking would be a DCO platform. That's one of our primary partners. And then obviously generative AI is creeping up on that. So I think of it in terms of the tools. And then when you talk about data and personalization, what we're dealing with a lot is building, going beyond the tools, but operationalizing the processes that teams have to go through, because we're now crossing multiple parts of a holding company business unit and organization. We pulled it all apart about 15, 20 years ago, and now we're trying to bring it all back together, right? So we're trying to get creative teams and production teams and media teams to understand each other's language and vernacular. And there's probably not a lot of people who can seamlessly move across those fluently. But our processes are around how do we create personalization at scale, which we think of in terms of, kind of a 6-part phase in which all the teams have to be working together, right? So it's audience segmentation creation, building content matrices against those audience segments, producing the content, at a much higher scale than we used to produce it at. And then setting up and configuring that within the systems, getting it out there, and then optimizing against that, right? So we're working really hard organizationally on getting everyone to understand how that has to function. We aspire to a day where, it's a different ad in every home, right? Basically, based on what we know about you as an individual, you as an audience, or you as a household. And we really spent the last 10 years in media building that infrastructure. And now we're trying to get creative and production to come up and enable the content that we can have that variety and variability to send those unique messages and have more relevance in what we talk to you about based on what we know about you. Obviously being privacy sensitive to that. So that's always privacy and personalization are always, a double-edged sword, but as long as it's permissioned, we hope that it adds value to the overall ad experience.
Bryan, I feel like you just coined the term creative evolution revolution, and I love it. I think it's great. You've been an amazing guest. I know this is very, very quick, but I really appreciate you taking time out of your day. Again, thank you to everyone who is joining the first episode of the AdTech Forum. This is brought to you by Flashtalking by Mediaocean. We've really covered a lot in a very short period of time. Stay tuned for more episodes of this series. See you all next week.